Hello, I'm Nick Gowing. Welcome to the Emmanuel Centre here in central London for this Intelligence Squared debate on how the West should respond to the so-called Islamic State, or ISIS. Beheadings, crucifixions, the attacks in Paris, control over billions of dollars in oil revenues, and extraordinary global digital power to influence people. Currently, IS controls significant tracts of territory in parts of Iraq and Syria, calling itself an Islamic caliphate. Western leaders say IS must and will be destroyed, and currently they're only using air power. The new Russian intervention to support Syria's President Assad has now complicated all of that. Some Arab states are in recent days considering deploying military force, including ground forces, against IS. Should the West do the same? So the motion for this Intelligence Squared debate: defeating ISIS means Western boots on the ground. We have an excellent panel for you. Arguing for the motion: four-star American General John Allen. Until last October, General Allen was President Obama's special envoy to the global coalition to counter and defeat ISIS. And Douglas Murray, the award-winning political commentator who specializes in the Middle East, terrorism, and national security. Against the motion, Ken Livingstone, Mayor of London when the 7/7 attacks on public transport 11 years ago killed 52 people on the tube and on a bus. And Rula Jibrail, journalist and author, foreign policy analyst, focuses on Islamic extremism and the new political order in the Arab-Muslim world. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speakers. Well, shortly you'll hear from the four speakers, two for the motion and two against. I'll then throw open the debate to all of you on the floor to hear as many views as possible from both sides, including the third view that you're undecided at the moment. Let's first, though, go to the opening statement from the four panelists. Speaking first for the motion, four-star US General John Allen. As a US Marine officer, he was involved in military operations in Iraq in Anbar province in 2007. He was President Obama's special envoy for the global coalition to counter ISIS until he chose to step aside late last year. General Allen, the floor is yours.
So let me start my portion of the debate this evening by utterly confusing the event. I am both for the motion, defeating ISIS means Western boots on the ground, and I'm against it. And let me explain. In any crisis like this, the decision to commit force falls into two broad categories. The decisions are not and cannot be binary. The reality will be that the actual commitment of force will exist along a spectrum of capabilities that generally are dictated by the political environment, by the strategy, and by the operational realities. So to the suggestion that we employ large-scale conventional formations, let me say that we're actually quite good at this. And there might be substantial short-term accomplishment which would make us feel good about that deployment. But in the longer term, and an even greater disruption of the political and social fabric is more likely the outcome in the region, a region that is in deep crisis now. The other choice, the one I strongly support, could generally be described as enabling the indigenous force. That is, supporting and training and equipping and advising and assisting local forces, ultimately to be the defeat mechanism. And so in the end, elements of both choices are necessary for defeating this scourge. So what does this look like? And let me just make three broad points. What we're doing, what we ought to do, and what else we might consider with respect to the commitment of forces. Critically, what we're doing now must enable and support the Iraqi security forces and Syrian opposition elements to physically defeat this organization on the ground. Whether that's the Sunni tribes or the Sunni Arab states, it is essential that the ownership for the defeat of ISIL be in the hands of the indigenous population of that region, as King Abdullah II of Jordan said. So in this, we're already seeing some success on the ground, given the forces from the West that have been committed. And these forces are performing the following functions: precision strike with coalition air power, as Nick said, advisors at various levels, which are scalable depending on the operational environment, the capacity building sites, training sites located in Iraq and in the region, where the indigenous population is being trained and equipped to be the lead elements in fighting ISIL. And now we're beginning to move some direct action, Tier 1 strike force elements into the region to pair with indigenous special operators to strike key ISIL targets as we discover them. That's what we're doing. What we should consider are additional advisors, which could accompany a broader spectrum of formations farther forward in the conflict, the potential employment of helicopter gunships, the creation of a joint special operations task force, either in southern Turkey or northern Jordan, manned by Western special operators, but dedicated to the training and the support of indigenous regional special operators so that they are supporting our Syrian partners and to some extent the Iraqis and the Kurds in taking the fight to ISIL. And then my one large formation recommendation is to create a mobile special operations or an airborne task force, again located outside Syria or Iraq, but very close, supported by combat aviation, which is transport and helicopter gunships, that can move very quickly to a vulnerability that we might detect in ISIL's outer crust, strike that vulnerability, crush it, turn it over to the indigenous population, withdraw quickly from the region, and prepare once again to go after the next vulnerability that ISIL might reveal. We should be considering how we in the West, with boots on the ground, can support stabilization operations for the liberation of populations from ISIL's domination. We have to give the displaced populations of Iraq and Syria a place to return to, other than potentially to come to Europe. So we should consider the temporary deployment of security forces to provide security to those liberated populations until indigenous forces can be trained for that security. So in the end, I'm both for the motion. It will require specialized and carefully calibrated and deployed Western, Arab, and Sunni military forces to defeat ISIL. They're doing it now. But I'm also against the motion that where we find ourselves today in this battle with ISIL, we should commit large-scale Western formation of combined arms forces. It boils down essentially to this: we do it and hand it off, or they do it with our help. History has shown over and over that the latter approach is the least disruptive to the social and the political environment and brings us the greatest likelihood of success. Thank you.
General Allen, thank you very much indeed with that carefully calibrated argument that certain boots on the ground will be helpful. Let's go now to the first voice against the motion. Ken Livingstone, one of Britain's most prominent and renowned political figures, been a long-standing critic of Western foreign policy, widely praised for how he led the UK capital's response to the 7/7 attacks in 2005. He recently caused outrage from some by saying the 4 bombers gave their lives in response to a war caused in part by British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Ken Livingstone, the floor is yours.
By saying I want to see ISIL destroyed, not just because it represents a threat to those of us living here in this city, as it did in Paris, but even more so because of what it imposes on the people that come under its control. The most awful brutality and beheadings and crucifixions, but the subjugation of women back into a sort of semi-medieval state. The question is, how do you do it? My fear is that if it's simply seen as Western troops on the ground, and there have to be troops on the ground, I suspect in their millions. If it's just seen as the West, though, I think that becomes a recruiting agent for other fundamentalist terrorists in many nations. It's got to be seen as the world acting together, not America and Britain and most probably France intervening in their own interests, which is how the West is perceived all over the Middle East. We have to look at the situation of involving nations like China and Nigeria and Brazil, so it is not seen simply as us once again intervening in the Middle East because of our desire to control the supply of oil. We also need to look at how this problem's arisen. It isn't just in Syria and Iraq, in Libya, in northern Nigeria where it's Boko Haram, in Mali. Right the way across the Muslim world, these intolerant terrorist organisations exist, and even if you destroy ISIS in one of its areas, that won't necessarily tackle, and won't tackle at all, those other areas. Where did this come from? The CIA estimates that in the 1990s, Saudi Arabia was spending $3 billion a year and funding the intolerant Wahhabi strand, which has helped to fuel not just ISIL, but also, of course, many other terrorist organisations, and in particular Osama bin Laden. Western governments have not been prepared to criticise Saudi, which has been the principal funder of Islamist terrorism and intolerance. Equally, if you look at our record of interventions, they have been disastrous. There was a democratic government in Iran in 1953, a sort of a leftish guy called Mossadegh, who won the election fair and square. He then nationalised the oil. Britain and America organised the overthrow of that government, imposed the Shah, a brutal dictator for 25 years. If we hadn't intervened in Iran, if we'd been prepared to pay them a fair price for their oil, we might see in Iran today a very Western-style and tolerant functioning democracy. Then, if you look at many of the other actions we've taken, whether it's been in Iraq, and you know as much about that as I do, it's been so well reported. The simple reality is Western interventions have been counterproductive, haven't resolved any of these crises, and if we wish to bring this terror threat to an end, we've got to look for a much broader coalition, bringing in, as I said, nations like China, who have many more troops available for this than most Western countries, one has to say. But it's about ending the double standards. Every day we see in the papers a criticism of Russia's appalling bombing of many innocent civilians in Syria, but virtually nothing about the fact that Britain is advising Saudi Arabia on the bombing of rebel groups in Yemen, causing equal, if not greater numbers of civilian casualties. The simple reality is great powers do terrible things. Whilst claiming to be fighting for justice and democracy, they actually defend their own interests. And that's how it's been for centuries. If we want to actually end this threat, which is growing and spreading, we've got to look beyond our own interests and build that broader coalition that will bring the millions of troops that you are going to need to eliminate this threat to us here in this city, but even more, the appalling horror they impose on the people they control in the areas under their command. Thank you very much.
Ken Livingstone, the first speaker against the motion. Let's now move on to the second speaker for the motion, to Douglas Murray, Associate Director of the Interventionist Henry Jackson Society, a prolific journalist, writer, broadcaster, a vocal critic of the West's lack of will to confront ISIS. Douglas Murray, the floor is yours.
You've just been given one tour of history, and we could spend all evening giving different tours of the same history. Even those of us who have been in favour of interventions at times in the Balkans and in Iraq and Afghanistan may well have, and ought to, in my opinion, have, second thoughts on intervention and its utility on occasion. Syria, for me, is just such an occasion. It's been my belief for the almost 5 years now that the civil war there has been going on, that it is not in our gift or in our power, and I say our, I mean America or Britain or Western powers, to knit that country together. It is not in our gift. And if you believe the Pottery Barn rule, that if you break it, you own it, then we should be very careful not to help break Syria, because we don't want to own it. Now, having said all of that, what is different about this? What is a rationale for committing any troops, even the specialist multinational troops of the kind that General Allen and I are proposing tonight? What is the rationale for projecting those into Syrian territory? Well, it isn't hard to go through all of the terrible, bleak, nihilistic things that ISIS does and to find rationales in them, but I'm not going to do that. It is something that can be summed up in two individual places which should resonate in any hall like this here tonight. The first is Tunisia, the massacre of 30 British tourists on a beach enjoying their holiday, a cold-blooded and deliberate attempt on their lives for the crime of being on holiday, an act which ISIS has repeatedly attempted to carry out elsewhere. And the second name is Paris, because a group that plans and plots and carries out attacks like that on our friends, on people you know, on people we know, for being in a hall like this tonight, perhaps less well guarded, perhaps in London next time, perhaps a hall, children's age, perhaps a concert, perhaps a restaurant. That's why. Because ISIS alone of these groups at the moment not only says what it wants to do to people like you and people like me, but it is trying to do it. In the last few months alone, it has made repeated attempts, as the Prime Minister said recently, thwarted attempts to carry out such an attack here in the UK. When it happens, and I obviously, like everyone else, hope it does not, but when it happens, we will turn around and say, and look back at an evening like this and say, what the hell were we thinking of? Even wondering whether we ought to be crushing this group with everything at our disposal or not. What the hell were we thinking by even doubting it? Now, we have to be careful. Obviously, we have to be careful. ISIS is a millenarian, end-time theological group. There is no reason why we cannot be intelligent about this. Too, as General Allen, with his unparalleled experience, has already laid out, to be intelligent about this, to get a regional force if we can put it together, to try to make as large a coalition as possible, not to tell ISIS in advance what we are going to do, but to make the decision, to be resolute, and to make sure that a decision of all civilized people, led by us if it has to be, decides and then goes through with the act of snuffing this group out completely. Thank you.
Douglas Murray, the second speaker for the motion. Thank you. Let's now move to the second speaker against the motion, Rula Jibrail, half Palestinian, half Italian, born in Israel, and now one of the best-known voices from the region as a foreign policy analyst, journalist, novelist, and broadcaster. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm here tonight, actually, with a sense of déjà vu, because we're again lectured, with all due respect, by two white men who are telling us that we need another war in the Middle East, and we need to send your children, your loved ones, to die for a war that we know that we cannot win. These wars, as they sit side by side, by patronage, followed by unconditional support and empowerment of corrupt, abusive tyrant whose abuse have helped foster mass radicalization across the region, and not now, for the last 4 decades. We backed Egypt, and we still back Egypt. What they give us, political Islam. The first person that was killed when millions of Syrians stood up demanding equality, democracy, and freedom, he was 13 years old. He was from a city called Daraa. The regime arrested him, tortured him, slashed his penis. They shot him with 3 bullets in the head. They returned him home. John F. Kennedy used to say, the president, when you make nonviolent revolutions impossible, what you're doing is you are making violent revolutions inevitable. This is what the Assad regime gave us, ladies and gentlemen. So what you will be doing, basically, sending people, troops on the ground in Raqqa, the capital of ISIS, knowing that there is a civil war, which no civil war in history has been solved with troops. Actually, in order to defeat ISIS in Syria, you have to address the Syrian issue. Tyranny and tyrant in the Middle East live in symbiosis. They galvanize each other, legitimize each other. Assad did a logical choice, in his case, and a strategic choice. While he was killing, in 2011, pro-democracy activists, cracking down on them on a daily basis, bombarding them, he did something else. He released hardcore jihadists. One of them was Allouche. He went on to become the leader of Jaish al-Islam, the guy that is not considered part of ISIS, but another group who's fighting, actually, sometimes ISIS, and promised that in case of, even if you eliminate ISIS, he will become ISIS 2.0, basically, another ISIS. For now, the overwhelming majority of Syrians don't see ISIS as their primary threat, because they see Assad as a major enemy. They will never fight ISIS until the 2 conditions are established on the ground: safety and justice. And I say that because I've seen over and over in the Middle East where we back these tyrants, they produce terrorism, and they force foreign interventions. It's time to interrupt this cycle. I just want you to know that General Petraeus, the guy that led the surge in Iraq, became the CIA, he opposed actually sending troops on the grounds, as President Obama, as every candidate on the Republican side, even the crazy ones like Donald Trump. There's a political process in place. There's talks in Geneva. Before we send, again, these troops, like we did in Iraq and we did in Afghanistan. And by the way, there's 3,700 special troops already in Iraq, and there's 10,000 in Afghanistan. So I would like to know from John Allen, what is the number and which Western country will send? And I would like you also to ask General Allen, who led the coalition to counter ISIS, why did he fail to convince President Obama and Congress and the CIA? Were they pacifists? No. They just know a bad strategy when they see it. What can change the game on the ground for the first time? A genuine empowerment of people who, in 2011, after bin Laden was killed, went to the streets, millions, and demanded democracy, dignity, and a better life. Yes, history can go forward and backwards and sideways, but it always bends toward justice. Thank you.
So there, ladies and gentlemen, you've had the arguments for the motion and against the motion. How were you thinking when you came into this hall a short time ago? Well, most of you haven't made up your mind. You come here to find out what the arguments are. 17% for, 16% against, 67% undecided. So both of you have a lot of work to do. We'll be reflecting on that later after you voted a second time. Let me open the floor now to those who want to contribute from the floor. There are microphones. Where are you, please, microphones? But General Allen, I need to ask you, first of all, that challenge we've just heard from Ruler Jabrail, 3,200 troops already on the ground, true or false?
It's 3,700 Americans, and there are more other non-American European troops.
So boots are already there already?
That's right. The boots on the ground have been there for a long time, actually.
Sorry, in Syria too, there's 250 special forces.
That's right.
Well.
And secondly, the practical business. Your job was building a coalition. We heard from Ken Livingstone, you need to build a very broad coalition, and in doing that, you will get millions who can then counter ISIL. What's the problem building a coalition?
Well, Ken rightly pointed to a number of countries that are not in the coalition, but we've had conversations with them.
Does that mean they're in or out?
That means they're not in the coalition, but they're willing to help.
But that idea of millions joining a coalition in order to combat this evil threat?
Broadly, look, broadly, we're facing the globalization of the so-called caliphate. We need to get as much attention into the coalition as we possibly can, and to the cause of countering the kind of extremism that Rula has talked about.
So, General Allen, you're actually saying globalization.
Let me finish.
That means they are in Syria, they are in Iraq, and they're in Libya. So you're telling these people that you would like to send troops also to these areas.
I didn't say that.
So what is the suggestion?
Let me finish.
Why would it be different?
We have to fight today because ISIS is coming for us. But we shouldn't have to fight forever. We have to fight to defend ourselves. That's the near battle that we have, and they're coming for us, and we need to be able to defend ourselves. But that's, let me finish. But we have to be circumspect in what are the basic causal factors that have created the environment in which people feel they have no hope and are willing to blow themselves up because of that. It's not just a military battle up close. It's got to be a long-term strategy to try to resolve those causal factors that have created such a widespread radicalization that trend ultimately to extremist organizations. It's not a single proposal. It's not a single, let's fight them everywhere forever. I don't want to fight them everywhere forever, but we're going to have to fight to defend ourselves, and we're fighting right now.
Right. We can see the tension here up on the platform between both sides. Let me hear more. First there, second here.
I'm currently writing a book about Islam, and what I'd like to ask is, how is it possible to defeat the perception largely across the Middle East that the West is simply there to forward its own interests? How is that at all possible to move beyond that perception?
Rula, come back on that in a moment, but I want to get another couple of voices, and that lady there next.
I'd just like to...
Are you for or against, please?
Undecided. I'd like to ask Rula, I mean, certainly it's the first time I've heard it put, the case that actually it's the West who think they're fighting ISIS, where for the Syrians, they're actually fighting Assad. So it seems that we're really at cross purposes, and there's no chance of us working together.
Yes, it will derail the political process. Western troops on the ground will derail the political process that is trying to take place in Geneva throughout talks so the civil war can end. Not only that, when General Allen says they are coming for us, they are. I'm sorry, ISIS is not an idea, it's everywhere. If you think that it's limited to Raqqa, where they control, or to Iraq, or to Sirte, where they control actually a city in Libya, and only sending troops into that will defeat them, it's an idea. We need to defeat the idea with another better idea, but also empower, end the civil war in Syria in order to do that. One last thing. I just want you to think of this data. Numbers are not opinions. In 2001, 3,200 died because of terrorism. In 2015, 38,000 people died. So if the trajectory of the war on terror, we are winning, somebody have to tell me in these 14 years what they've been doing.
Microphone 4, please.
Hello, my name is Aida. I'm Iraqi, and I'm from Mosul. I'm uncertain at the moment. This is a question to General Allen. To defeat ISIS, you quoted that we need to arm, train, and help the indigenous population of that region. But isn't that what was supposed to happen when you entered Iraq in 2002 and liberated us from Saddam Hussein? So I would like to know how can you assure us that this is not going to create yet again another mess and vacuum for other jihadists?
What I had proposed was not the large-scale invasion of Iraq that you're pointing to. What I had proposed is something more akin. If you're Iraqi, then you know very well what happened with the Sahwa al-Anbar and the Sahwa al-Iraq, which was the awakening, which was when the tribes of the Euphrates and al-Anbar were in fact supported, were in fact given the opportunity to defend themselves. They defeated al-Qaeda, they liberated their province, and they set the conditions, ultimately, for Iraqis to take back their lives from al-Qaeda. So the whole issue about whether I'm proposing an invasion to the region is not at all what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is giving the individuals who must fight ISIS the capacity to do so. And it doesn't require a lot of force to do it.
Sir, you trained only
I want to hear from Ken Livingstone. Ken Livingstone, this argument about giving capacity on the ground.
If you're going to defeat this group, you need a vast force. We fail to understand this is a deep religious divide. Forget just the terrorism. Between Shia and Sunni, it's almost like 500 years ago in Europe between Catholic and Protestant. And that is why the Saudis have broadly sat on their hands, and Turkey has, because they are not going to attack people that are Sunni, which is what ISIS is. They want to kill, as Saudis currently doing in Yemen, the Shia. And an awful lot of those fundamentalists that have been funded by the Saudis generally believe if you're a Shia, you should just be killed because you're a traitor to the faith of the Prophet Muhammad.
Douglas.
We're not trying to argue how we mend the Middle East, and we're certainly not trying to argue how you mend Islam. What we are arguing is that ISIS is a threat to people in this country, to our allies. We are not trying to mend Islam or Syria, but we think that ISIS is a problem, and that is what we're explaining. It's quite limited, really.
Right. I want to hear more voices, please. Now, microphone 4 at the back.
Simon Mail, former UK British Army General, for the motion. I'd like to pay tribute to John Allen's inspired, gallant and sophisticated leadership, both in Anbar and Afghanistan, a great friend of the United Kingdom and much respected by the British military. I'd like to say that Rula has talked about children being killed. They're already being killed. Shias, Sunnis, Yazidis, Kurds, and of course French. The debate is about ISIS. It's about a state, not a terror group, and it's growing. I'll simply say there are boots on the ground now. They're the only reason we're having any success, frankly, against ISIS from the Kurds or the ISAF. It's slow, and we're being oversensitive, to my mind. We need more. We need them nuanced the way John Allen has said, and that is the way we will enable the indigenous security forces to get a grip on this.
All right.
And the idea of being a spectator while we wait, I'm afraid, for Rula's nirvana to come is beyond comprehension. I vote for the motion. Thank
General
you.
Mail, thank you. The lady here, please. The lady here. This lady here. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ismina Siddiq. I'm undertaking an MA at the War Studies Department at King's College London. I'm currently against the motion, and I found Rula Jabril's argument particularly compelling.
Why?
Because I think there isn't enough discussion about political processes at the moment. I think we are taking too much of a military focus. My question is for Douglas Murray. I just wanted to clarify something that you said. Do you honestly believe that by having Western boots on the ground, we will prevent further terrorist attacks here? And if so, is that a legitimate reason, the protection of Western security interests, to invade another country? Thank you.
The answer to your second question is very simple. Yes, of course it is. Of course it is. Can you imagine... Can you imagine if you get home tonight and you read that you turn on your phones when you leave this place and you discover, say, that 150 people have just been slaughtered in London whilst we've been sitting here? Can you imagine what the response would be if the next day the Prime Minister said, well, it's just not a legitimate thing to intervene in other people's countries, even if our people are killed? We wouldn't expect that. No government would do that. The primary point of government is to protect the people in the country. The idea that that's become a sort of wacky, crazy, surprising idea says more about academia these days than anything else.
But honestly, I mean, I'm sorry.
And very quickly, there was one other very quick point. As for the issue of Western troops, look, I think it's been fairly clear. If the Chinese want to go in on their own and destroy ISIS with boots on the ground, I, for one, would be delighted. If the Jordanians and the Qataris and the UAE and Dubai and everyone else decides to send in troops and get rid of ISIS, I would be delighted. My point is simply that if it were to happen that they didn't do that, which is plausible, then it might end up with us having to do it. It may be a last resort, but it would be better than letting it just run and run.
Rula Jibril.
Ladies and gentlemen, we invaded Iraq. These gentlemen were in agreement. Syria, we are still operating in Syria. There's 7 countries, Muslim countries that have been bombarded. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Libya. These people told us that Libya, we will liberate Libya and it will be a heaven. It's actually today in a civil war, and ISIS controls Sirte, a city in Libya. 5,000 fighters are there. Bombarded Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. These are the countries. So for the last 14 years, the West was never a spectator. Did I agree with certain policies? I think certain policies are absolutely has been proven a failure. It's time to try something else.
All right, so for the moment, thank you. Right, the lady down here.
I'm against the motion. Partially convinced by what Rula has said, and sort of I had similar opinions in the first place. My question is for General Allen. How are you going to align all of these different partners with all of their different agendas and get them to work together to actually implement this strategy? I feel that's a crucial question.
General Allen, could you just stack that for the moment? I want to get more views. Over here, please. Are you for or against?
I'm for the motion. It appears the opposition has been speaking as if in our long war on terror we have achieved absolutely nothing, which is blatantly not the case. In the late 80s, had we not invaded in Kuwait, Kuwait would be the 19th province of Iraq. In 2003, had we not invaded Iraq, Saddam would still be in charge of Iraq. We have achieved things. Simply because we have not achieved complete success does not mean we have done nothing. Because there is still violence does not mean that we have achieved nothing.
Thank you. Down here. Are you for or against the motion?
I'm against. I've been working in the Kurdistan region of Iraq for almost the past 2 years now. And I'm all for building local capacity, but I have a problem with the lack of nuance in the debate tonight. So if we take Iraq...
Give us some nuance.
So, wait for it. So, for example, you talk about building local capacity. The Kurdish, the government's almost bankrupt. They haven't paid any public sector jobs for the past 4 months, at least. And I'm slightly concerned. Why does there have to be military force local capacity? Why can't you be talking about political solutions? Thank you.
Right, okay. Ken Livingstone, can you pick those up, please?
Let me start by saying that the simple truth is, we didn't achieve anything in Iraq. We overthrow Saddam Hussein, but the situation is worse. Under Saddam Hussein, a woman could walk down the streets of Basra in a short skirt. He kept fundamentalism in check. No woman would dare to do that today. If I was to say to women in this room, if you had to be transported back in time, would you rather live in the Iraq under Saddam Hussein or as it now is? It's worse. Exactly the same is true of Libya. A ghastly dictator in Gaddafi. We helped with the French to overthrow him, and we've created a worse situation, a country totally divided, and a fundamentalist group like ISIS, they're now based in it.
General Allen, a couple of questions to you there.
Yeah, let me just go back to the lady who raised the issue of the Kurds. I'd like to pay tribute to them because against all odds, they have been able to hold their own against Daesh. They have recovered all the ground that they've lost, but I think they'd be very quick in telling you that they would not have been able to do it had it not been for a relatively small Western presence that gave them the capacity to fight, and fight they did. West of the border of Iraq and in Syria, other Syrian elements, and we learned about them and their courage in Kobani when they resisted the assault of thousands of Daesh. When we provided support to them, they not only defeated Daesh, but they pushed Daesh well away from the Syrian border, tens of kilometers, inflicting thousands of casualties. These are people who fight. These are people with a relatively small number of Western troops. That's what we're proposing. We're not proposing large-scale ground maneuver forces, which has the effect, ultimately, of destabilizing the region. And let me just say, I worry about the continued rhetoric around the world that seems to vilify Islam because of a terrorist movement. Islam is a great faith. This is not about Islam. This is about a religious or an extremist element that attempts to hijack this faith. So my own personal experience left me with enormous respect for the region, for the people, and for the faith of Islam, and they want to liberate themselves. We should give them the capacity to do that.
General Allen, thank you. Let me go to, there's a lady up there who's got the microphone.
Hello, I'm totally against troops on the ground. I can't understand why the UK and the US government continue to supply arms to the Saudis and the Qataris who allegedly are supporting ISIS. On top of that, I wonder about certain American internet companies that allow horrendous pictures that are seen all over the world of people being beheaded, which then incites, people in the West to want to support ISIS, and then they're traveling across to these countries. On top of that, I have to say that Assad may not be a nice guy, but before everything kicked off and the West maybe supported small groups who wanted regime change, Syria was better off.
Thank you. Please, who's got the microphone here? For or against, quickly.
For. I served in HQ ISAF under General John, 2012-2013.
You're ex-military?
I'm currently serving.
Nice to see you.
Thank you. My question...
Thank you for what you did.
Thank you, sir. My question is, looking at the potential for the indigenous component in Syria in particular, but also potentially in Iraq, what is to be gained from a dialogue between the Assad regime and the Iraqi government, between the moderates and the Sunni population to fight ISIL on two fronts?
The gentleman in the corner there.
Hi, yes, I'm a medical student from UCL, and my question's for Rula.
Hang on, which way are you thinking?
I'm undecided. My question's for Rula, and the question is, given that what you're proposing is a diplomatic solution, and Assad's hand has been strengthened both by Russian intervention and Iranian intervention, how would the Western party to a diplomatic solution that does not involve Assad stepping down from power strengthen Western goodwill in the region?
The lady there.
I'm for defeating ISIS. I'm not for having a mass of boots on the ground. My background is that I have an Iraqi family. I am Iraqi. And just following on from Douglas Murray's answer to the lady sitting front right, you said that the government is supposed to protect the people. I completely agree. But would you not say that intervening has caused more violence, terror, and just in general dismay across the world? So in answer to Rilla's question, do I feel safer? No. Douglas Murray, do you feel safer?
Do I feel safer? It's an unanswerable question. The world is a very complex place, has a huge number of factors, a whole range of things that are a problem. My best answer to you is this: the way you will feel safest is if you know you have a government and security services and police and army and others who have your safety at heart. And if they do, then they should be doing everything they can to make sure that the primary threat to people like you and me is destroyed.
I will not support some limited intervention which will only fuel a recruiting sergeant for more terrorist groups, not just in that area, but across the whole of the Muslim world. We either have to have a huge coalition, as we did to defeat the Nazis, or we make matters worse.
Repeating the same failed policies of the last 15 years, thinking that they will produce a different outcome, is madness. Iraq invasion gave us ISIS. I love and believe in the militaries, in the people to keep us safe and secure as global citizens. I believe the military should do the strategy, but politicians should lay out the plans, and every politician on the right, on the left in America does not believe in this, because they've seen in the last, I would say, 14 years that the number of people who died because of terrorism skyrocketed, and the number of jihadists. Al-Qaeda disappeared or in the shadows now, operating in the shadows, but you have a worst monster, and we'll keep creating a worst monster. Don't deal with the symptoms. It's time to deal with the causes. Arabs, Muslims, want to handle their own affairs.
I'm now going to just pause a moment because you've all voted, but I want to ask a four-star general about one thing which came up earlier, just for a point of data for all of us. When does an advisor become a fighting wearer of boots on the ground? Because that seems to be the ambiguity in much of the argument.
The advisor creates and enhances the capacity of the unit in which that man or woman is serving to fight themselves. That's the whole purpose of advisors. That's what we're trying to make the point for. The advisors enormously magnify the capacity of countries, militaries, and small units in combat to be able to do the job for themselves. That's what we want. We don't want to do it for them.
All right. Thank you very much indeed. That was just a point of information for all of us, given the often interesting use of the word military advisors. Right. I now can share with you what the result of the vote is. I remind you that two-thirds of you in this room hadn't made up your minds. Almost all of you have made up your minds. It was only 16% of you for and against when you first came into this hall. The result is that only 8% of you haven't made up your mind. Against is 40%. 52% of you believe that there should be Western boots on the ground in order to defeat ISIS. So I declare the motion carried. Can I just thank all the speakers, you, the audience, for what has been a fascinating debate. My thanks to Intelligence Squared as well for making it possible. Goodbye from me, Nick Gowing, and everyone here in London. Bye-bye.